For generations, the Kennedy family built their identity on a single origin story. Irish Catholic immigrants fleeing the famine, arriving in Boston with nothing, rising through grit and ambition to the highest office in America. It became the foundation of JFK's political brand, repeated in campaign speeches and immortalized in tributes. Then, in 2017, a genealogist examining parish records in Ireland noticed something that didn't quite fit. And in 2023, when researchers finally obtained DNA from authenticated Kennedy family artifacts, the results appeared to challenge more than a century of accepted history. But the contradiction wasn't what anyone expected. The story begins not in County Wexford, where the Kennedys long claimed their roots, but in the baptismal records of Dunganstown Parish in 1823. Patrick Kennedy was born to a farming family in the townland of Dunganstown. Records identify his father as John Kennedy, a tenant farmer. In 1849, at the height of the Great Famine, Patrick boarded a ship to Boston. He was 26 years old. He worked as a cooper, married Bridget Murphy, and died of cholera in 1858, leaving behind 5 children. One of them, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, became a successful saloon owner and Massachusetts state legislator. His son, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., became one of the wealthiest men in America, and his grandson became the 35th President of the United States. The Irish ancestry was never seriously questioned. Every genealogist who examined the records confirmed the line back to Dunganstown. American and Irish historians treated it as settled fact. The documentation appeared airtight. Birth records, marriage certificates, immigration manifests, all pointing to an unbroken chain of Irish Catholic heritage stretching back through rural Wexford. In 1963, President Kennedy visited Ireland and stood near the Kennedy ancestral homestead. He planted a tree. He shook hands with distant cousins. The nation embraced him as one of their own. Newspapers carried the story across Ireland and America. It was a moment of validation, the immigrant's grandson returning to honor his roots. But no one had ever tested the DNA. In 2017, genealogist Helen Moss was researching 19th-century immigration patterns for the Irish Genealogical Society when she cross-referenced ship manifests with parish marriage records. She noticed something unusual. Patrick Kennedy's mother's maiden name appeared in the Dunganstown baptismal register as Johanna Kennedy. But in the Wexford Diocese Marriage Index from 1820, a Johanna Kennedy married a man named John Kennedy in a ceremony witnessed by 2 families who shared no obvious connection. Multiple Kennedy families lived in that region, and the surname was common. The assumption had always been that John Kennedy of Dunganstown belonged to one of the established local Kennedy lineages, but the marriage record hinted at something less straightforward. Johanna's family came from Adamstown, about 7 miles away, and the witness signatures included a surname that did not appear in the surrounding townlands. Moss began examining additional records, land transfers, tax rolls, parish censuses. John Kennedy's name appeared alongside Johanna and her family, but not independently before 1820. For a man living in rural Ireland at that time, that absence was unusual. Most people left some trace, a baptism, a tenancy record, a family connection. Yet John Kennedy seemed to appear only at the moment of his marriage. The questions grew. Who were his parents? Where had he been baptized? What family did he belong to? Then came the DNA. In 2023, a research team at Trinity College Dublin collaborated with the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. They were granted access to authenticated personal items from the Kennedy family, including a comb and preserved clothing fragments. Originally cataloged as historical artifacts, these items were never intended for genetic testing. but advances in extraction techniques made it possible to retrieve DNA from even minimal biological traces. The researchers extracted mitochondrial DNA, which traces the maternal line, and Y chromosome DNA, which follows the direct paternal line from father to son. They compared the results with genetic databases, including samples from families still living in Dunganstown who maintain detailed genealogical records. The mitochondrial DNA aligned exactly as expected. The maternal line traced back to Johanna Kennedy's family in Adamstown, consistent with long-established Gaelic-Irish ancestry. The Y chromosome results, however, were different. Kennedy men in Dunganstown today, descendants of relatives who remained in Ireland, did not share the same paternal haplogroup as the American Kennedy line. The lineages had diverged. That suggested one of two possibilities. Either a break in paternity had occurred somewhere along the line, or John Kennedy of Dunganstown was not originally from that community at all. Re-examining the parish records, researchers confirmed that John Kennedy appeared in Dunganstown only after his 1820 marriage to Johanna. No baptismal record, no prior residence, no clear family ties. The marriage entry listed him simply as John Kennedy, laborer, no father's name, no town land of origin. So where had he come from? Tracing the witness names from the marriage record led to nearby Enniscorthy, an area historically influenced by Anglo-Norman settlement. Medieval castles built by Norman lords still mark the landscape. Families bearing surnames of Norman origin, Fitzgerald, Burke, Roche, and Talbot, had long shaped the region's landholding patterns. The Y chromosome haplogroup identified in the American Kennedy line, while common in Ireland overall, showed markers associated more strongly with populations in southwestern Britain and parts of northern France than with some traditionally Gaelic-Irish clusters. The implication was not that the Kennedys were not Irish. By the 19th century, families of Norman descent had long since assimilated. They spoke Irish, practiced Catholicism, lived as tenant farmers, and endured the same hardships, including the penal laws and the Great Famine. If the genetic interpretation is correct, the paternal line may have originated centuries earlier among Norman settlers who arrived during the 12th century invasion of Ireland and gradually blended into Irish society. By the time Patrick Kennedy emigrated in 1849, his family was culturally and socially Irish in every meaningful way. They were poor, they were Catholic, they suffered famine. Their immigrant story was real, but their deeper genetic origins may have been more layered than the simplified narrative suggested. When preliminary findings were presented publicly in 2024, reactions were mixed. Some historians cautioned that genetic markers indicate probability, not certainty. Without a confirmed DNA sample directly from John Kennedy himself, conclusions remain speculative. Haplogroups overlap across populations, and interpreting them requires caution. Others argued that Ireland's history has always been complex. Viking, Norman, and other influences are woven into the genetic fabric of the island. The idea of a single, pure ancestral identity has long been more myth than reality. The Kennedy family has not released direct DNA samples for additional testing, and the research has not yet undergone full peer review. The baptismal record of John Kennedy's birth, if it survives, has yet to be found. What remains is a story that may be less about contradiction and more about complexity. The immigrant rise from poverty to power remains true. The suffering endured during the famine remains true. But the ancestry behind that story, like much of history, may be layered, shaped by centuries of movement, conflict, and assimilation. If the DNA interpretation holds, then the man who became a symbol of Irish Catholic America carried within him the intertwined legacy of many chapters of Irish history. And perhaps the real question is not whether that complicates the story, but whether it simply makes it more complete.